Here. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. It is always up to speed with Formula One. It is March 5th, 2023. Round one of the Formula One World Championship is now in the books for 2023. That is Mark Daly here and Mr. Mark Hamilton to round up the very first race of this 23 race Formula One calendar. Hammy, after all the weeks and months of waiting, it is finally over. And boy, do we have a lot of things to talk about. But how are you doing this evening, my friend? You feeling kind of like a little sort of like opening round hangover, all the weeks and months of anticipation? Or are you feeling good tonight?
Let's reflect back on our text messaging between each other a little bit earlier today. I wasn't in a great frame of mind following this race, to be totally honest, and I had and reflecting on a comment that I made to all of our listeners on the show a couple of weeks ago, which was don't take too much from this race. Don't take too much. Don't get too excited. Don't get too down. So I'm really going to lean into my own recommendations from a couple of weeks ago and try to get through this podcast in a better frame of mind than I was certainly feeling a little bit earlier. But all of that said, there were a number of different storylines here, and there's certainly some interesting things to talk about. So I think we can get right to it. But my friend, how the heck are you?
I'm good, man. It's been a busy but enjoyable weekend, and Formula One has just really been the cherry on top, the icing on the cake. So excited to get this one going, but also kind of enjoying the weekend wrapping up and just taking it into the start of the new week in a nice and relaxed sort of way. Okay, so where do we want to start? Should we just why don't we just go down the final race classification because that will nicely kind of frame where we want to go with this. So the top 10 for the Bahrain Grand Prix, Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez coming home 1-2 for the first Red Bull double podium 1-2 finish of the year. Then you had Fernando Alonso, the two-time world champion from 2005, 2006 in do we want to call it a shock podium because he certainly had the pace throughout the weekend, throughout winter testing. So great to see the two-time world champion on the podium again for the first time in many years. Then Carlos Sainz came home fourth for Ferrari, Lewis Hamilton fifth for Mercedes, sixth was Lance Stroll, the second Aston Martin. So a double point finish for the first race of the year for the Aston Martins. George Russell was seventh, and then eighth was Valtteri Bottas for Alfa Romeo. Pierre Gasly scoring points in his debut for Alpine, and then coming home in P10, Alex Albon for Williams, which was a pretty solid result for them. And then also his teammate, rookie Logan Sargent, the American, coming home in P12. Now, that is one of the stories that I wanted to talk about this weekend. Obviously, maybe not the biggest one, but a very good showing for Williams this weekend and a sign of respectability, which is great to see. So, Hammy, what do we want to talk about here? Because we had, let's just kind of set it up. We had an all Red Bull front row, Max and Sergio lining up 1-2, then two Ferraris, Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso and George Russell lined up on row 3, Lewis Hamilton and Lance Stroll on row 4, and then row 5 was the unfortunate Esteban Ocon, who spent more times going in and out of the pits today for one penalty after another and then being penalized for it and then being penalized for not serving the previous penalty properly. I think he got penalized at least 3 times today. It was a little bit crazy. And then finally P10 or starting 10th on row 5 was Nico Hulkenberg on his return to Formula One, this time for Haas. So, Hammy, with
Red
all
Bull,
that
Red
in
Bull,
mind.
Red Bull. Let's start with Red Bull. So, and I'm gonna jump
Yes.
right in here because I'm eager to talk about this. So, Red Bull finished 39 seconds ahead of Aston Martin, who of course scored that wonderful podium today, and I do look forward to talking about that. They were 48 seconds ahead of Sainz, and they were 51 seconds ahead of Mercedes. So, all the flowers, all the gifts, all the praise to Red Bull that they seemingly have taken everything that they did last year and seemingly bettered it which I think is a phenomenal testament to everything that they're doing in that factory in Milton Keynes. But I think, unfortunately, and this is, I think, maybe the reason I was a little bit negative in our group chat a little bit earlier today, is my hope was that the field was going to be a little bit closer. And again, Mark Hamilton, one race. We're one race in, but the race pace of Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez today was astonishing. They were absolutely miles ahead of the rest of the field. And George Russell, following the race, had made some comments about the fact that he expects them to win every single Grand Prix this year, which is a little bit alarming. And I'm sure in the heat of the moment, after a disappointing seventh place finish, you're probably going to feel that way. But I think my main concern here is, one, it's problematic that we're now moving into, I guess this is year 2 of the new regulations and year 3 of the cost cap, and we still have one specific team that is miles ahead of the rest of the field, right? And the technical regulations and the new era of chassis development and the cost cap were supposed to bring the field a little bit closer together. And you made that great point earlier when we were chatting in our group chat that, hey, take out Red Bull and let's have a conversation about the rest of the field. And was that a good race? And you could maybe make an argument it wasn't terrible, but if you just look at this as a complete race classification, Red Bull dominated the field. And unfortunately, I worry, and I know it's only Sunday, March 5th, that we're still sitting here in the winter, but I worry that this is going to be a common thread throughout the rest of the season, and that furthermore, this will be a common thread through 24 and 25 until we get to 26 and it's a total reset. So all the praise to the Milton squad team. They looked absolutely phenomenal today. Absolutely phenomenal. Didn't step a foot wrong.
Well, again, I mean, they had the right strategy. The car was good. There was, there were no issues with the reliability. I know that Max made a couple of comments throughout the race, but I have to, ask the question: did either Sergio or Max actually break a sweat in this one? I mean, Sergio maybe at the beginning of the race, because he had that terrible start where it looked like he was going to go backwards through the field there for a moment, because he was lucky he only got passed by one Ferrari, because it was nearly both of them, but he recovered nicely. But anyhow, I wanted just to address those, the comments that you made about George Russell, and I just want to read them out because I've got them up here in front of me. So George said after the race, quote, "Red Bull has got this championship sewn up. I don't think anyone is going to be fighting with them this year. I expect they should win every single race this season. That is my bet. With the performance they've got, I don't see anyone challenging them. Their pace seems weaker this weekend than it was in testing, which is a bit strange, but they've got it easy at the moment and they can do what they like. They might not get on pole all of the time because we know that the Ferrari are very competitive in qualifying, but when it comes to race pace, I think they're in a very, very strong position," end quote. You know, I find this interesting because I find it a little bit ironic to hear this come from the mouth of a Mercedes driver, albeit one that wasn't there for that prolonged run of domination from 2014 to basically 20 halfway through 2021, if you want to maybe be a little bit generous there. So for better on 6 or 7 years, they were the team that were basically winning every race that season. But he makes a very, very good point in the fact that they still have this really, really strong pace, even though it might not be as quick as it was in winter testing a week ago. But again, it is the first race of the season, and as much as I was a little bit disappointed to see how easy they made it look, that we still have 22 races to go, and anything probably can and will happen. And that's why I said in the group chat today, guys, let's just take them out of the conversation, and let's take a look at some of the other things that we saw happen. I mean, Lewis and Fernando had a great scrap on the track. I mean, the Aston Martins were exciting to watch. The Mercedes boys were mixing it up. We saw action all up and down the field. It's just like you say, it's unfortunate that there was this gap of 30 something odd seconds between the Red Bulls
And
at the front
I,
of
I would
Fernando
add
Alonso.
too, it could have been significantly more. It was pretty clear that by lap 40, Max was absolutely just managing his tires and managing
Yeah.
the race. And I think probably by lap 2:43, significantly detuned that power unit just to conserve that internal combustion engine for the rest of the season, so they don't take any early penalties for swapping through their allocation. but they were shockingly good today. And it's weird. It's like this weird sensation of having to balance the praise for this team, but also the sense that they're so good that it could be damaging to the championship. And all of that said, though, I mean, we went through this in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, right? And Formula One survived, but I don't think it's good that these mechanisms that Liberty brought in, including the cost cap and the new technical regulations, were just supposed to bring the field a little bit closer together. And hopefully you're right. There's 22 Grand Prix left. Anything could happen. This is a unique track. It's a high deg track. We're going to Jeddah in 2 weeks, which is a very different type of tracks with some very, very high speed corners, a much smoother, less abrasive surface. So again, the results could be different, but at this point, it's hard to imagine anybody else winning a Grand Prix this year. And you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about the fact that, hey, this is probably going to be the year that Lewis wins another Grand Prix. He didn't win one last year, but based on the trajectory that Mercedes were on last year, they're probably going to win multiple races this year, right? Like George won in Brazil and Lewis almost won in Austin. That they're probably going to win a couple of races, and not so sure anymore. And maybe that's the perfect pivot, because I want to save the good stuff for last. Like, I'm super excited to talk about Alonso, as you are, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's probably worth talking about, or transitioning over to Mercedes, that as much praise as you can throw at the Milton Keynes Red Bull squad, I think we're probably all just left with a total, I don't know, like, period of like confusion and frustration, that we want multiple teams contending for a title. And we got a sense during practice that Mercedes probably wasn't it yet, but I get the sense that this team is in a really, really bad place from a development perspective. And there was a great quote here today from Toto Wolff. This was reported through the German press, and Toto Wolff says, there was not a single positive thing we can take from this race. We're lacking pace. The drivers have to push, and that's hurting the tires. Red Bull is on another planet. Aston Martin has the second quickest car. It was a real wake-up call for us. So, my friend, my question for you is, here we are. We're now one race into the 2023 Formula One Championship. They came back with that zero pod design. And whether it's that's not working, or something else on this car, what does that wake up call lead to if you're Mercedes? Like, you have to be happy with your driver lineup, but where do you go from here?
Yeah, and that's where it becomes like a head scratcher for me, honestly, Mark, because I would have thought that the wake up call probably should have been what, maybe Spain 2022.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
like honestly, right? Because I mean, as much as I admire like their commitment to this design philosophy that they've come up with, that they introduced last year on the W13, it clearly hasn't worked out the way that they wanted. So I know that they committed and stuck through it last year because they thought that they could get the car to perform the way that they wanted. Once they eliminated the porpoising issue, they thought they could do something with it. But I was surprised that even though they did eke out some performance gains here and there by the end of the season, they weren't light years of clawing back that delta between themselves and Red Bull. So when they came back and introduced the W14 this year, which looked like almost an identical carbon copy to last year's car, I was like really surprised that they did that, because and especially when you hear like this, the chatter saying that, well, if this car doesn't pan out, that we've got plans for a completely, radical new car to go. If this one doesn't pan out, we're prepared to jump on that pretty quick. So, and that to me, that seems very un-Mercedes like, because in the past, whenever they've had issues, they seem to have been very decisive. This is the problem, this is what we're going to work on. It was basically 24/7, solve the problem. And I know we're in a cost cap era now compared to was even just a couple of years ago, but it's just it's the language and the stance that they're kind of taking. It's very, to be, I wouldn't say wishy-washy, but it's not very decisive. And that to me seems very un-Mercedes like. So if this weekend wasn't a wake-up call for them, and if they do have these rumored plan B plans for another car, I would be digging those things out of the filing cabinet or wherever they're keeping them and get that thing dialed up pretty quick, because it looks like Aston is for real. I mean, Lance obviously was what, P8 or something like that, and this is a guy that just had surgery on his wrist 2 weeks ago and
P6,
was
P6, man.
P6. I mean, P6 and a P3 for both Astons. I thought they looked really good. I kept asking the question, as good as Fernando looked today, I couldn't help but wonder how much better it could Lance have been, because even though he cleared all those medical tests, you can't tell me. And if I was talking to Lance right now, I'd be like, come on, buddy, be 100% honest with me. Like, how close are you to 100% today? And I'm sure that Lance would probably admit, he might tell you like exactly where he's at. He's like, yeah, I'm not at my, my peak. I am not right where I need to be. But going back to Mercedes, I think that wake up call has come and gone, and I think that they need to do something like yesterday to get it turned around, or else this season is going to, well, I mean, Red Bull is, a completely different question, but if Aston is for real and if Ferrari get things figured out, then they could find themselves being the fourth quickest car on the grid, and that is very un-Mercedes like.
Daly, you make a really great point about them having this plan B up their sleeve ready to go, because that Toto kind of talked about that during winter testing, right? That, hey,
Yeah.
we have this plan B if it doesn't work out. But what did you see during the off season? Like, what did you see in the wind tunnel and when you were running your CFD models? Like, what did you see that made you confident in the W14 as it is right now? And that's where I'm confused, because you've seen vast
Yes.
transformation of other teams, and
Yes.
we'll get to Aston Martin, but Aston Martin pivoted hugely towards the Red Bull design philosophy. They're totally cool, 100%. That's what happens, and that's how Formula One works, and clearly it's worked for them. But Mercedes seems to be doubling down in this design formula that didn't work for them last year and clearly isn't working for them now. So to your point, like, if they have a plan B, obviously, I don't know if you're going to be able to roll it out for Jeddah, because I don't know where those parts are and I don't know where they're in the development and the build cycle. But you need to be ready to go for Australia. Like, that plan B car, like, you have nothing to lose right now. You are not contending for a world championship, and you are certainly not contending for race wins. That if there is a plan B, execute that plan B, because you have nothing to lose.
I think that is a phenomenal point, Mark, that you make. Is like, what did they see in the wind tunnel testing and the CFD data this year compared to like last year? Because obviously they thought last year, when they got out of the factory and out of the design shop to the track, that this was a car that was going to do something good, that was going to be on par or better than any of the cars that came before it, and it didn't. And they struggled with it to try and get their mind around it all season long. It looked like towards the end of the year that they were finally getting it figured out. But then that's the thing now. I mean, I think that is the key question. Like, what is different with this design philosophy this time this year compared to this time last year, with a year's worth of real world data under your belt that you've had like an entire winter to analyze and throw into the design and build of this new car? I think that's a great question. It's just like, but then again, it's like, how much longer more do you wait before you decide once and for all that we got to pull the plug on this, and then maybe go on a more divergent path or convergent path
Daily,
towards
daily.
the Red
And
Bull, right?
and and this is the kicker, man. While you're positing and while you're stumbling and while you're bumbling, Red Bull is working on upgrades too. Like, they are going
Oh,
to bring
exactly.
multiple
Yeah.
upgrades. It's not like like, obviously there was a wind tunnel penalty. We all get that. And
Yep.
maybe that would have hampered some of their design goals, but they're still going to roll out multiple upgrades this year. It's not like their design and engineering team is frozen, that they have their wrists handcuffed. They will continue to roll out upgrades this year. So you are very much on the back foot, my friend. And it's a little bit scary. My friend, do you have anything else about Mercedes, or should we go on to Aston Martin or Ferrari? Because I think there's
I
lots to talk about
do.
with both of them. Yeah,
I
please.
this is kind of like this will be like a blanket statement. I mean, I'm only going to bring it up now. I could have brought it up when we were still just talking about Red Bull, but I just kind of wonder how long, like, if we see Red Bull go and knock it out of the park again and have like this huge gap between themselves and everyone else after Jeddah, after Australia, after the first 2-3 rounds of the season. when are the, the discontented voices throughout the paddock going to start piping up and saying the penalty that they got last year wasn't enough? They are living off of ill-gotten gains from this overspend. Is clearly a development on last year's car, which we think is illegitimate. It should have never been allowed. And then like not only do we have like doubts on the legitimacy of like that car and that championship and all the results from last year because they breached the cap, they've been able to improve upon it. They're even better. We're not in a position to catch up to them because even though they've had that penalty, we still are spending within the cost cap, and it's not fair. Like, I haven't heard that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised, like especially in 2 weeks after Jeddah, if we see something similar that the usual suspects might start piping up in the media. And I'm just kind of saying, well, let's like, how long before that conversation starts in the media? I'm sure it's happened behind closed doors.
My response to that is similar to what we talked about a lot last summer, which was the penalties for a cost cap breach were agreed upon by all the teams. And it doesn't mean
Yep.
that there won't be whining and complaining, because there sure was a lot of it last summer. That's for sure. And I would say that normally the folks that you would probably hear from, being Toto Wolff and Zach Brown, I think they've got their hands full with their own cars, man. Like what we saw out of McLaren today and what we saw out of Mercedes, like they've got their own world of problems right now. But yeah, I would agree that they're, if not from the paddock, then from the media for sure, people will start questioning whether that penalty was significant enough or not. But then again, those penalties were outlined in the financial regulations and all of the teams signed up for that. So it is what it
Yeah.
is.
Is just sort of sit back and grab the popcorn, because I think it's just a question of time before this bubbles up to the surface and becomes like a public conversation again. Anyways, I do want to go on to Aston Martin. I want to talk about them. I want to talk about Ferrari. Got to talk about the McLaren hype machine and the disappointing outing that we saw today, because that's kind of like another thing we were talking about earlier today as well. Do that in a moment. We're going to hop away for a quick message from our sponsor, so don't go away. We'll be back on the flip side. All right, everyone, welcome back. Mark Squared here to break down the first race of the season. We've already been through Mercedes, we've been through Red Bull. The story of the day, though, in terms of drives and people that weren't in a Red Bull, would be the Aston Martins of Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. P3 and P6 for the two British Racing Green cars, which, honestly, now that I've seen all the cars together in one place at one time, I think that Aston Martin is, to me, it's the best looking car on the grid. Although I did have a bit of a complaint, especially in the night race. From distance, it was a little bit difficult at times to make out which was the Aston Martin, which was the Mercedes. That British Racing Green being so dark at night at certain angles looked like it was almost black. But anyways, I mean, just from it's just a beautiful looking car. Anyways, Hammy, you wanted to talk about Aston Martin. Your turn to run away with it. I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, let's jump into this, right? That this Aston Martin, the AMR, is it AMR 23? I've got to get all this dialed in. But the AMR 23,
Yeah.
obviously, this is the third year that Silverstone based squad has raced as the Aston Martin team, and I think in 21 and 22, you and I were climbing the mountains with Bell, singing the praises of Lawrence Stroll and everything that he was doing with that team. And I think both of those seasons were somewhat or largely or very disappointing. But there was a different vibe around that team at winter testing this year. And I think part of the vibe was that they'd signed up Fernando Alonso. And that was obviously a big story last summer when he got that big multi-year deal worth tens of millions of dollars from Lawrence Stroll. And he was kind of stolen away from a team in Alpine that thought they had kind of had him under lock and key. But I think one of the things that's exciting about Fernando Alonso is you can never for even a second challenge his commitment on track. And I think you and I, sitting here throughout the winter, kept referencing back to the fact that if there's anything to be gotten out of that AMR 23, out of that Aston Martin, he will get every ounce of power, every ounce of performance out of the car, and then some. And we saw obviously the two Aston Martins qualify really well, and then both of them executed. Actually, to be fair, during the formation lap, Lance looks a little shaky when he goes a little deep on turn 10. I'm shaking my
Yeah.
head. And then when he made contact with his teammate a little bit later, I was shaking my head still, and I was a little bit frustrated. But they look absolutely exceptional. And it's funny because there was comments throughout the week from Total Wolf that the Aston Martin is half Mercedes power unit, Mercedes gearbox, Mercedes rear suspension, and then at the same time, there's comments coming out of the Red Bull camp that it's half Red Bull. Helmut Marko said on Sky Sports Germany that several engineers had actually left for Red Bull with Aston Martin, or for Aston Martin with Dan Fellows, and he said, unquote, in German, it looks like they all have a very good memory. So it's funny how you have these two other teams on the grid that are taking partial ownership of Aston Martin, but they are making me eat crow because I sat here for the past 2 years talking smack about customer teams and customer teams not being able to compete in a meaningful way with a works team. And here's Aston Martin, and it's early. We're one race into the 2023 championship, but they made Mercedes look terrible. And Fernando Alonso was worth every cent that he's being paid on that contract. And we don't really know what the contract is, but he looks exceptional. And you hear that term, that verb sometimes, like, oh, he was really racy today, which meant that he was a little bit
Mhm.
aggressive. He was exceptional, and he was fighting and fighting and fighting. And in doing so, you learned a lot about the Aston Martin as well. You learned about how well mannered it is in corners. You learned how deep you could go into a corner without jumping on the brakes. Like, the brakes in that car are exception, which means that the cooling for the brakes is really good, and they're extracting seemingly more power out of that Mercedes power unit than Mercedes is. And I think that you have the effectively, like Total Wolf says, the Aston Martin, which is half Mercedes and it's running circles around the Mercedes, and really the only principal difference is aerodynamics. Like, that just reinforces the fact that Mercedes is very clearly directionally going in the wrong direction. But all the kudos in the world to Lawrence Stroll, Mike Crack, Dan Fellows, all the engineers that came over from Red Bull, Lance Stroll, Fernando Alonso, like, all the praise to that Silverstone team, because they seem to have made a meaningful change. They're 2 seconds a lap quicker than they were this time last year. They look exceptional. And I promise you, this won't be the only podium that Alonso has this year. And I would expect to see Lance score podiums this year. Now, all of that said, and I kind of wanted your perspective on this as well, and I'm eager to hear your feedback and your thoughts about Aston Martin. I still don't think Lance Stroll should have been out there. I think what we learned in free practice was that he simply isn't 100% in terms of being able to maneuver that car on the track. And I think and somebody else had made this comment on Twitter or on another podcast, but they made this point that had Aston Martin not looked so good in winter testing, he probably waits it out till Jeddah, right? Like, you're going to take that break, but I think he got a case of FOMO sitting there at the hospital in Spain and watching Felipe Dragovic just like cane that car around the track in Sakhir because it was so good. I think there was a case of FOMO, but ultimately, you know what? He qualified well and he finished P6. And I don't know what more you could have asked for him. He split the two Mercedes. He finished a spot ahead of George Russell. What a great weekend. What a great result for Aston Martin.
Yeah, 100%. And I echo those sentiments, Mark. Like, I really questioned whether or not Lance should have been in the car this weekend. I mean, I don't question his dedication or his toughness or anything like that, but it's just like it comes down to just a safety question, issues. Like, even though he's passed all those safety and like protocols or health checks, whatever you want to call it, set up by Aston Martin, set up by the FIA, etc. He passed all of those. It's just like it's still 2 hours almost under grueling circumstances. It's got to wear on a person. I mean, if you're only 2 weeks removed from that, but I agree exactly with what you say. But in general, a P3 and a P6 for Aston Martin, great result. I mean, if you go back and listen over the years since this team rebranded, right from the beginning, both you and I we were like, this is the team we really want to see succeed. We had big expectations for them, and they've underwhelmed and they've disappointed. I mean, this time last year, it was just like, whew, after a couple of races, we are like, this is not looking good. We get to, I believe it was Spain last year at Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix. They introduced the upgraded car there. and it showed some signs here and there, but it wasn't like this immediate performance gain of like a second or a second and a half. I mean, they've had to work at it, and I was very, very surprised to see the times that Fernando and Felipe Drugovich were putting in during winter testing 10 days ago or whenever it was. And I was really quite excited about that. But I'm like, well, it's winter testing. Take it with a pinch of salt, because we don't know how because everybody's doing different things and they're not necessarily in race trim. They're not exactly all running in the same configuration. So it's like, how do you really what's the benchmark to compare everyone else against each other? But just terms of pace, they seemed pacey, right? But this weekend, it was just impressive to watch, and then it was great to see Fernando and Lance. Even though Lance obviously had a bit of a moment there, not just on the opening lap or the warm up lap, but also on the opening lap when he went a little bit hot into one of those corners and accidentally tagged Fernando's right rear tire, and Fernando lost a position or two there. And I mean, the commentary was at the point is like, well, does he have a puncture in his right rear tire? I mean, fortunately, it worked out for both of them. In the long run, it worked out even better, because Fernando got onto the podium. But it's great to see, and I find Fernando is such a, I don't know, confusing figure, because at times over the years I've loved him and I've hated him. I mean, to me, he's sort of like the quintessential anti-hero. I don't know what other way to really describe the guy, because I mean, it's a little bit beyond, it's a rabbit hole we don't really need to go down to. But I mean, you either love him or hate him for various reasons. But today it was apparent that despite being 41 years old, I mean, he has not lost any pace. I mean, he looked great out there in the car, just dicing and racing with everyone. I thought that was a bit of a juicy scrap that he had with Lewis Hamilton. And I thought it was interesting when he got within about a second or a second and a half. It was interesting to hear, sort of like, I was jumping back and forth on the in-car cameras and listening to their comms on both of them. And he felt that he had better pace, and then it was just like, well, let's just sit here and see what they do. And then he's just like, well, he's got more tire tire deg than we do. And then you hear like Bono and Lewis talking that well, our tire management is good, the tires look good. So it's kind of funny to see that. But then you kind of had like this little scrap going back and forth, and then Fernando passes him, and then Lewis takes the position back right away, and then eventually Fernando gets him on that one part going into that hairpin. I guess it's turn 10 onto that second DRS zone in the middle of the circuit. That was a great move. Full respect to Fernando for pulling that one off, and especially on a person like a driver like Lewis Hamilton. But very exciting to see, and I'm glad just in general that just for one race, and of course we've got 22 to go. It's just like, at least what we've seen through winter testing the first weekend of the year, the Aston Martin looks like a good car. Whether or not it remains that way, we'll talk about this in 2 weeks, a month from now, etc., as the season goes on.
It's probably worth revisiting the driver silly season from last year, only because it's fun. But we all recall, right, that allegedly, apparently, according to Otmar, there was an agreed upon contract on the table between Alpine and Fernando, and he took that secret meeting with Lawrence Stroll and he signed the deal with Aston Martin. I think at the time people were probably saying like, that's a bit of a downgrade in terms of performance, but clearly
100%.
he
Yeah.
signed the right deal. And then subsequent to that, after he departed, of course, Alpine announced that Oscar was going to take that seat. And of course, then Oscar tweets like, no, I've not agreed to this. I'm going to McLaren. And so he goes to McLaren. And again, it's early, but I also feel like Oscar may have made the worst decision here simply because that McLaren is going to be a handful and it's going to be a project all year. And I think you could make a meaningful argument that they may be a bottom 8 team this year. Like they could finish 8th, 9th, probably not 10th, but 8th or 9th in the Constructors' Championship, and nobody would be surprised. And meanwhile, Alpine, and again, you talked earlier about the fact that Ocon, it was a horror day for Ocon right from the opening formation. Let's write it off. But again, Gasly, qualifying very poorly, manages to squeeze into the points. That of those three teams, Aston Martin, Alpine, and McLaren, right? Like if you had a choice of racing for any of those teams, it's going to be Aston Martin, it's going to be Alpine, and then a distant third is going to be McLaren. And I like the word that used hype machine a couple of minutes ago, that this team has been so good at branding and marketing, but seemingly they, from a performance perspective, they've fallen off a cliff the past couple of years. And I certainly don't think we're going to see a ton of ground made up this year, but just interesting to see how those three drivers fare this year based on the decisions that they made, right? Like they were
Yep.
all completely autonomous in those decisions, but it'll be interesting to see how they play out. My friend, anything else about Aston Martin? And I
I
also
do.
agree,
I
by the
do.
way, just on
Yep.
that comment that you made about Fernando being an anti-hero. I don't think I've ever cheered for him, and I'm not saying I'm a Fernando fan. Somebody's going to go in the ratings and call me a Fernando sycophant, but I did cheer. Like I had an audible cheer erupt from my body when he overtook Lewis Hamilton today. Like I just thought, this is good for the sport. This is good for him. This is good for Aston Martin. And then I thought it was fantastic to see Lawrence and Fernando embrace after the race. I thought that was very, very cool because these two have a significant amount of history. And like somebody had said on the broadcast today, if not for the fact that Lewis had 5 more championships than Fernando may have long ago retired, that he may simply be going right now because of the spite that he feels towards Lewis Hamilton. But it was really great to see those two embrace after the race.
Yeah, that was a cool moment, and there is no doubt about it that Fernando was a very, very polarizing figure. Like I said a few minutes ago, you either love him or hate him. But I was just checking his stats as you were talking there, Mark. So this was, his podium today in Bahrain was his 99th of his career. So the most recent one prior to this one was in
Qatar.
2020, yeah, in Qatar in 2021. And then before that, you have to go back to 2014, his last season with Ferrari. He scored 2 podiums that year. He had a third in whereabouts was it? I lost it here. So he had a third in China at the beginning of the year, and then he had a second in Hungary. But so 1 podium away from 100. So the way that it shakes down, 32 race victories, 37 seconds, and 30 third place finishes for the two-time
When
world
was
champion.
while you've got those stats up, when was his last Grand Prix victory? Just as a point of reference.
So his last Grand Prix victory would be in 2013. If you just bear with me, I'll pull that up here in a moment. That season, but just sort of talking about things as well here. That when it comes to the other drivers there, that it is fascinating, right? Because they did talk a bit about that in Drive to Survive, like that whole kind of like saga there, and we'll talk about McLaren in a moment. But I thought that whole thing when it came to the way that kind of shook out between Fernando and Alpine, and the way that Alpine was kind of left kind of like hung out to dry, and then not only by Fernando but then also eventually by Oscar Piastri as well. It was really kind of like crazy to watch. Okay, so going back to Fernando now, so 2013 was a year that we saw Fernando, or sorry, not Fernando, but Sebastian Vettel win the world championship. That was his fourth and final one. So Seb won one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine, about 10 races that year. I'm not going to count them all up, but Fernando was the one of only three other drivers to win that year. So he won 2 races. Lewis won in Hungary that year. Nico Rosberg won in Monaco and Great Britain. But Fernando, his last race win would have been the Spanish Grand Prix in 2013. He also won in China that year. So got to go back almost 10, pretty much a decade to the last time he won a Formula One Grand Prix. So whether or not he pulls it off this year remains to be seen, but certainly a podium is nothing to turn your nose up at. So Mark, you brought up nicely the examples of Alpine. You brought up McLaren. Let's talk quickly about Alpine. I thought that they were very disappointing today. I think that you got to give Pierre Gasly credit, because I think quietly he drove that thing around and brought it home into P9, which I think is pretty decent for his race in something that wasn't branded as a Red Bull in one form or another for the entire length of his Formula One career to date. And I was expecting a little bit more from them. They were a little bit anonymous today, and this is a team that kind of I think snuck quietly into fourth place in the World Championship. So I was expecting to see a little bit more between Aston Martin and, well, maybe not so much Aston Martin because they kind of leapfrog a little bit higher up, but I certainly expected more from Alpine. But Esteban Ocon, he was just a disaster today. I mean, first of all, he gets hit with a 5 second penalty for not lining up in his start position on the grid properly, and it was obvious when you saw the replay. So he gets a 5 second penalty for that, and they were changing his nose. They started doing that before they're even allowed to. They have to wait the full 5 seconds before you can touch the car. So they get smacked with another penalty, and then he came in to serve that penalty, and then got another penalty for serving in the pit lane. There might have been one more on top of that. Eventually, he retires the car a couple of laps from the end. And I thought it was kind of funny the way that they put one of his race or clips from the race radio up on the feed there. At one point, he's like, "Oh, they let these things go all the time. Why are they cracking down on them all of a sudden?" I'm just like, sorry, Esteban, but the last time I checked, there's always been a speed limit in the pit lane, at least in living memory. And then also the fact that, if you have a 5 second or a 10 second or whatever, however many second penalty, you can't touch or do anything to the car until that 5 seconds or whatever it is over. So I thought that was a little bit kind of interesting, but yeah, quite disappointing from them. But I don't really want to dwell on Alpine more than necessary, Mark. I think that we need to talk about McLaren because last year I don't think it's fair to say that they were disappointing when it came to where they finished up in the constructors championship. And this weekend, I know that they said that they know that there's some issues in this car, but they feel that this car is more developable than any other car on the grid, and there's got tons of potential. But they were just not in a good place. I mean, if you look where they started in, let's look at qualifying. So they were right down there. I mean, Lando was P11, Oscar Piastri, he was P18, didn't even make it out of Q1, and then Piastri doesn't even make it more than a handful of laps before having to retire the car, which I think was probably maybe a little bit of karma at hand. I would have loved to be like a fly on the wall when Otmar Safnauer saw that pop up on the race feed that Oscar Piastri. I mean, he's probably obviously moved on, but from that whole saga, but. Just disappointing. Then Lando made what, about 5-6 pit stops in the end. He had all sorts of problems with the car, but we called it the hype machine, right? And I feel that and you do as well, that they have done a very good job at really polishing themselves and really pumping them up to be like this maybe not quite like a Mercedes or a Ferrari or Red Bull, but definitely the best of the rest. And the sponsors by and large have bought it. I mean, you look at that McLaren, it's decked out in Fortune 500 companies. I mean, Google Chrome has the spot of honor on the side of the engine cover there. But I mean, the results last year weren't great. We had the high profile and sudden departure of former team principal Andreas Seidel over the winter, and you know, just not a good look for them today. I mean, there's still obviously 22 races to go, but I saw very little from McLaren on Sunday to walk away with anything other than some very negative vibes. Mark, take it away.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add on the McLaren piece. You and I talked a couple of weeks ago about the fact that at the car launch, Zach Brown was playing down expectations. And I made that whole analogy about that's just smart business. Play down the expectations of the analysts, so when you come out soft, you don't get crushed in the media. But they weren't soft. They were atrocious today, and I really wonder now in hindsight what the motivating factors were for Oscar to leave Alpine. And I get it. The Denstone facility is not great. It's a little bit older. They desperately do need a new factory. Uh, I can't understand why he would make that move unless Zach Brown and the McLaren team had just this phenomenal next level sell
Hype
job
machine.
to get him there. Yeah, the hype machine, right? Like they just show him a list of all your sponsors. You've got Google on the wheels. You got Coca-Cola on the sides of the side pods. Like I don't get it. And again, there's still room, but again, when you make comments like this could potentially be not you, but when McLaren make comments like this is a very adaptable car and it's got lots of room for growth, that's just code for the fact that it's underdeveloped, and you need to own the fact that this car is underdeveloped. And just as we used McLaren and or just as we used McLaren as a comp to Aston Martin, I think you need to use Aston Martin as a comp to McLaren, because again, McLaren is another Mercedes power unit base team. So they have the exact same power unit. So the cars, I don't want to say, not power to weight ratio is not the right term because all the cars have to weigh the same, but it's going to have the same center of mass. Like if Aston Martin can pull this off, like theoretically, if you have comparable resources and you function under a cost cap, you should be able to do the same. So very, very disappointing to see where McLaren finished today. But my friend,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
just realized we're sitting here at 44 minutes. We haven't even mentioned Ferrari yet.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to bring up one more point about McLaren. We'll jump into a quick break, and then we'll talk about Ferrari to bring it home, bring it back to the pits. That'll be our cool down lap for tonight. Anyways, just addressing your comments about McLaren. So this is a team that we know has been pretty upfront and clear that they know that the car isn't what they want. They've really gone all in on this upgrade package that's going to come at race 4 in Baku. Several weeks from now. Andreas, sorry, I was going to say Seidel. I'm starting to get mixed up between the former and current team principal. Andreas Stella said, quote, when we say fixable or unfixable, we need to be clear about what we're talking about. The main limitation that we have at the moment is aerodynamic downforce. Obviously, we can improve the rate of development in the car by having better infrastructure, by having more workforce, and this is why we are having the investments that are ongoing now at McLaren. However, I think that for the level of talent and availability that we have in McLaren already, we can recover and we can outdevelop the other teams, because what we see in development right now is very alive in terms of development, or pardon me, is a very alive car in terms of development, end quote. So like you say, Mark, this is a car that wasn't fully, it wasn't where it needed to be when they hit the track for winter testing, and certainly not by the beginning of the year. So anyways, take it where it is. It is a bit disappointing. We'll see where they end up by the time we get to Baku, but it could be a bit of a bumpy ride until then. Anyways, time for another quick break. We'll come back. We got to talk about Ferrari, and we'll do so in just a moment, so don't go away. All right, welcome back. So yes, we haven't forgotten about them, but perhaps one of the teams that obviously is absent, or conspicuous by their absence, is Ferrari again. Well, Charles Leclerc was one of the only few cars that weren't classified at the end of this one, and his teammate Carlos Sainz faded, quite a bit, and was quite a bit off the pace, not even making it home onto the podium. Hammy, kind of more of what we've seen from Ferrari. Maybe their strategies and the call on the pit wall wasn't as horrible as it was, last year, but we saw some problems with the car. But even before Leclerc retired, there was an estimate that they're at least a second off the pace when it comes to front runners Red Bull. And after one race, I don't really see a lot to be very or overly confident in Ferrari. Bearing in mind it is a long season and there's a long way to go, but I just kind of felt like it was a bit of Groundhog Day today. I felt like we've seen this movie before, and I really felt frustrated by that because as we talked about a couple of days ago on the weekly show, that of course new team principal Fred Vasseur, he came in so late during the off season. Of course, the amount of input that he's had onto into the design of this new car is minimal, but he can help out and really make his influence known on the pit wall with the strategy and everything behind the scenes. But still, having said that, even though that the stuff off the track was a bit better today, on the track the results were fairly on par for what we've seen, at least since about a third of the way through the 2022 season. Mark, your thoughts on Ferrari?
Right. Lap 41 of 57, Leclerc seemed to be in a reasonably comfortable podium position before he seemingly lost power, not hydraulic power, but seemed to lose the electronics and the drive and the power unit. he pulled over. And again, it was this crushing moment that we saw all too many times last year. And the story, as it's been explained since then, is that overnight on the Saturday night, Ferrari discovered that the power store, which is just a fancy way of saying the battery plus the associated electronics, the battery didn't discharge properly. So they ended up having to switch out the battery store in his car before the very first race. So he's only got one more. And after that, he's going to take a 10 place grid penalty, which isn't an ideal place to be in. So they swapped it out. And then seemingly that is the component that failed. Obviously, cost this team a host of points, potentially cost Leclerc a podium. I'm not necessarily sure if he would have held on because obviously Alonso was charging, and we saw the significant degradation that Carlos Sainz was having in his car, which is of course what gave Alonso the ability to sneak past him. Well, not sneak past him, race right past him. But again, super disappointing. And if you're a Ferrari fan, if you're a member of that team, it just must be an absolute gut punch. One, it's kind of two pronged, right? Which is one, like you said, they're a second off the pace of Red Bull. They finish what 40 plus seconds off of the pace of Red Bull at the end of this race. And then you'll have another self inflicted DNF. And if you're Charles Leclerc, how many times is this? And it's not like he's got anywhere else to go, but ultimately it's crushing and it's just absolutely I'm struggling for words here, but it's a morale destroyer for the team, for everyone in the garage, for everyone back at the factory, and for your driver. And I think it's awfully hard to come back from that. Like obviously he didn't just lose the championship, but to be in the frame of mind that you're going to score a podium on a day where your primary opponent is running away with the race, like that's something to hold on to. You get that trophy, you get to go up to the front, you get to be in that kind of shower of fizzy water or rose water. That's something. But to DNF again, man, is just absolutely shocking.
Oh yeah, absolutely right. And you could just hear the disappointment and the frustration in his voice, like over race radio when he pulled off to the side of the track, and it just seemed so. I wouldn't say predictable, but almost expected that something was going to go wrong for them at some point. And I mean, with Carlos Sainz, it was just I mean, he just really wasn't there. I mean, he was very scrappy at the start of the race, as Charles was. I mean, what with Perez getting off the line, as slow that he did, but I mean, once the race kind of like was a couple of laps old, they just kind of like sort of settled in, and that's kind of where they went. Anyways, Carlos had to say that the pace of the AMR 23, which when he was talking about just the well, I guess about everybody else who wasn't driving a Ferrari, said that he was very concerned about the pace of the Aston Martin, and then he went on to say, "quote I wish that as soon as we go to the other tracks where we cook less of the rear tires, we can hold on better. It's clear that their car has something, both the Red Bull and the Aston, where they degrade a lot less. If you look at Mercedes and us, we have very similar degradation. The other two cars, for some reason, they don't degrade. It's something we will have to look into, analyze, and see what we can do." End quote. So Carlos Sainz, putting like the issues on lack of pace and performance today in Bahrain solely on tire degradation. And it's funny that wasn't really brought up at all during the race itself, but well, let's wait and see what happens. Hammy, do you want to talk about anything else? I feel like we should dedicate at least a couple of minutes before we wind it up to Williams, because as I said at the top
Yeah,
of the
that
show,
was exactly. I
yeah,
knew you were super excited. So I have, by the way, I have the first round of scoring for the Scuderia F1 podcast Super League 2023. So I'd love to share that before we sign off.
okay,
But I
sure.
know you were very excited. And again, I was a super downer about this. I'm like, I'm not giving flowers to Williams after they've been in the basement for 5 years. But I think
No,
it's worth
and
I think
rightfully
it's worth
so.
commenting on their
Yeah,
performance
no,
today.
I thought that was a great comment that you made when we sat down and did our DTS reaction show with Seth, what about 3 4 days ago, whenever it was, and they barely featured it all except for a couple of snippets of Yos Capito here and there throughout the entire season, and I think that was a fair comment, Mark. I mean, you want to feature it all, like even on a show like DTS. I mean, you need to do something positive. I mean, apart from Alex Albon's drive in Australia last year, where he managed the tires and brought it home, what was it, P9 or P10 that day? That really was the highlight of their season. I mean, it was pretty dire all around. But today, in the points on the very first go round. So you had Alex Albon in P10 and Logan Sargent. He was P12. I think, Hammy, for a team that has struggled for years and years now, at least since what, 2015, 2016, 2017, I kind of lost track. It's been a number of years now. I think this is something that they could really take and I wouldn't say it shouldn't be giving everybody the day off tomorrow to go congratulate them for a job well done, but they should be very satisfied with that. I think James Voles, the new team principal, I think this is probably as much down to a change in the leadership and hopefully his influence after all those years at Mercedes have really are rubbing off. I mean, he did say in the last couple of days that he figures that the job at Williams is about what he expected. It's going to be tough. It's going to be one that's going to be take years, not months. And it was interesting. He kind of pulled back the curtain a little bit on that one and said that the problem that this team has had is due to a lack of investment and to too many changes in leadership over the last several years. And that's really, I mean, you have that tumble down snowball effect, and that's where they ended up last year and in previous years. That wasn't an accident. It just didn't happen overnight, but it was a culmination of many things. But as we talked about it at the time, I guess about 3 months ago now, at the beginning of December, when they announced that Jos Capito was not going to come back, as well as their TD, his name escapes me at the moment, that they were, mutually agreed to, part ways, or however politically correct, or however they wordsmith that one together. But I thought that Voles was a good signing. I got a bit of a different vibe because it's not this wasn't new territory for Williams to install somebody that was a former Mercedes employee as the team principal. We saw that about 4 or 5 years ago with Patty Lowe, and that obviously didn't work. And so, of course, again, as I've said with every other team that we've discussed, that of course it's a long season, but first race of the year, I think, is a great result for them and for a team that both you and I have a very nostalgic soft spot for. It was good to see. But Logan Sargent, I want to hear your thoughts on Logan. P12. I mean, a bit quiet during the race, but I think that's a very, very promising result for a rookie driver.
Shout out to the young Canadian driver, Logan Sargent, or Canadian if the F1 qualifying graphics would be to believe. I don't
I
know if
know,
I was the
right?
only one that picked up on this, but I'm just
No,
like,
you weren't.
that's really sloppy. That clearly they just, it went to the graphics, their graphics engine, and found Nicholas Latifi, backspace, 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 Logan Sargent, and never updated the Canadian flag. But I think he demonstrated a significant amount of composure today. And obviously Albon put in a very good performance as well. And maybe you and I have to start recalibrating our understanding of what the capability of that car is, right? Like we had a flurry of retirements today, but there were still a number of cars that they meaningfully outpaced today, which is really positive. And maybe this will be a really great driver pairing for them to move forward with. But yeah, it was great. It's awesome to see a young American driver on the grid, as you and I have been hoping to see for a very long time. And I think that given the fact that he's driving the Williams car, this was a dream debut for him, an absolutely dream debut. And he comes across as a great guy. I spent a lot of time listening to his post race interviews as well, because I wanted to get a sense of his tenor and his attitude. But he comes across as a really good kid. And I know that
Yeah.
seems very cliche, and I know that sounds very generic, but he's very, very likable. And I think that's important in terms of him getting the backing of the American sports fan, and ultimately getting the American marketing machine that will inevitably come calling if he demonstrates even an ounce of success or manages to get into the points pretty consistently this year.
Yeah. Okay, Hammy. Before we go, I'm going to wipe the slate clean here, so you can close with the first round of fantasy scores. So I'm going to do that just by reading out the constructors and drivers' standings. We'll just go down the top five in both. And so the top of the constructors' standings after one race in the 2023 Formula One World Championship, we have Red Bull with 43 points. Second is Aston Martin with 23 points. Third is Mercedes with 16 points. Fourth is Ferrari with 12 points. And rounding out the top five in the Constructors' Championship is Alfa Romeo with 4 points. On the driver's side, leading the way, Max Verstappen, 25 points. Sergio Perez, second Red Bull driver with 18 points. Fernando Alonso from Aston Martin, 15 points. Carlos Sainz, 12. And then rounding out fifth in the Drivers' Championship at the moment after one race, Mercedes is Lewis Hamilton with 10 points. So, Mark Hamilton, over
Let's
to
do this.
you.
Let's do this.
Let's
So
do this.
the
I'm pumped
final
to hear.
number, the
Yep.
final number is 859 entries, which is
Wow.
amazing. Thank you to
That's
everybody.
that really filled up in the last couple of days. I mean, it's
It
well down
did.
on last year, but considering how late they opened up and considering how many late entries we had,
We had less than a
kudos to every.
week. We had
Yeah.
less than a week, which made it really, really tough. So to everybody
Yep.
that got out there, fantastic. Of course, we've got great prizes this year. I am currently, not that anyone particularly cares, but I'm currently ranked 216th with 271 points. But here is the top 50. So I'll make this very quick. We have two people tied at number one, Fire Ferrets and Long Ships. At number three, FRDP F1. Number four, Phil's F1 Team 2. Also at number four, CDP Racing. Also at number four, JHAM 0528. Also at number five, Ole's Lena's. Number eight, Pat Vent 2. Number eight, Sausage Curb. Number 10, Bem. 11, Selma's Better Half. 12, Brooklyn Bagel Race Club. 13, Gentle Walter. 13, Tyson VO2. And 15, Stroud Racing. I'm going to say this one too. 16, Danny's Leftover Nuts. Okay. So that is our top 16, and hopefully we'll see lots of variation and change as the championship goes around because we want to make sure it's as interesting as possible. But shout out to Long Ships and Fire Ferrets for locking in the number one spot for the first race weekend of the year.
I'll have to take a look and see where I've lined up because unlike last year, I did actually field a team, but if I'm not in the top five, not that I can actually win any of the prizes that we have, but
Are you
it
Mark
is.
BC guy? Is that you?
No, I'm not.
No.
I'm not. So, here we go. So let's see. Let's see if I can figure out exactly where I'm at. I'm going to put it in.
Are you
Clicking.
Dr. Marco's Funhouse?
No,
Dr.
it's
Marco's Funhouse.
yeah. Anyways, I'm clicking on it. And of course, it being as horrible as it is, it's not coming up. It should come up as Scuderia Westwood F1 or something like that.
Ooh,
That's my
I can
team.
find
So,
you. Apparently I can't, which might
well,
mean that you're out of the top 500.
well, that would
Yeah,
be
it only
very on
shows
brand.
up to the top. It only shows the top 499. So it's possible that you didn't slot into the top 500.
Yeah, it probably is because my team did not perform all that very well. I think I'm going to dump Lando Norris. I bought into we talked about the McLaren
Yeah.
hype machine. I bought into the McLaren hype machine, and unfortunately they let me down badly this weekend. Anyhow,
All right, buddy.
enough said about that. I won't bring this personal stuff into this just yet, unless I end up last. Then I'll curse everybody for my mistakes. But yeah, we'll leave it there. Mark, thank you so much for doing this tonight. We've got, I guess, just a regular show coming up this week in a couple of days. Thank you, one and all, for listening to our first race recap of the season. If you want to get in touch, send us a tweet at ScooterF1Pod or email at scooterF1Pod@gmail.com. On behalf of myself and Mr. Mark Hamilton, thank you very much for listening to the show, and we'll catch you again in a couple of days. Bye for now.